Thank you very much, Peter. Well, it's very nice to be here. I was realising as I walked across on this sunny morning that I've been coming here for various reasons since about 1981. So, always seems to be some regular reason to come. My first university job was at University of Leicester, and from there I moved to the Open University, where I stayed a long time, and then I've been at Cambridge. So I've had quite a bit of variety of kinds of teaching. I mean, the move to Cambridge is quite interesting because, as John will know, because John was at the OU with me, I mean, at Cambridge we have master's courses, and we're really told that, to be viable, they have to have 15 students on them. And at the OU, it's 250. And Andy Northridge, who is not here, but I've been working with him on these ideas, has been in charge of one of the most successful of the OU's courses, K101, the Applied Social Sciences, and they have 5,000 on it. So, you've got quite a lot of variation in what higher education really means, but I'm hoping to say something that is relevant to anybody working in any kind of higher education situation. I've worked with Andy on this because we've been meaning to work on this for a while, and his work has been more directly concerned with higher education pedagogy as research than mine, which, as some of you will know, has been more concerned really with dialogues in school and the training of teachers. Andy's also one of those unusual things, the author of a million-selling academic bestseller, the Good Study Guide. So he does know what he's talking about. So I'll be drawing on his ideas quite a bit as well. Thinking about, the variety of ways of that higher education can go on, I think it helps, I think, as a sort of heuristic to think of what kind of models do people invoke for higher education, and even if they're not made explicit, what are they and how have they perhaps changed, and how do they, represent dialogues as being important or not. So I think there are a vastly oversimplification, like any of these things. Get it down to a 3-point list. There are 3 kind of models, I think, of higher education, which are those. And they've coexisted and been relatively more or less ascendant over the years. At my current institution, the most established one was, of course, the apprentice scholar model, the way that people learnt at Cambridge for a long time. People just came up and read the subject. On the whole, the role of the teachers there would be to tell them what to read or to suggest that they read things, and then they would, critique the students' work, sometimes in rather brutal ways. It seemed to be acceptable. And the odd thing is that in that model, lectures were quite incidental. We sort of think of lectures as, even nowadays, being the essence of higher education, but that wasn't how those particular ancient institutions really did see them. So much so, as you can see one of the quotes here, that William Empson, who's a very, very famous literary scholar, and was a big fan of T.S. Eliot, when he was at Cambridge, as it said in this review of a biography of him, didn't bother to go because it wasn't cool to go to lectures, even though he liked, what they were about, So I think that's an interesting thing. And this model clearly works. I mean, it worked for Newton, didn't it? So can't be that bad. But it does have some problems. One is that it denies the importance of things like this, and I think that is rather strange. And I think, obviously, things have moved on in many ways since. And again, it presumes a highly motivated student. It presumes a student who has gone there really wanting to go and probably sees this as a particular privilege to do so. I mean, I was with some American visitors yesterday at Cambridge, and we got a tour of King's College Chapel. And one of the porter there, he acts as a tour guide, and he shows you around. And you find out things when you go with visitors, don't you, that you'd never find, on your own. And he was saying that it was set up by Henry VI as a place that boys from Eton could come and have their education finished. And they didn't have to pass any exam or anything. They just kind of came, the ones who were shown that were keen enough. And then after being there 3 years, they got a degree without taking an exam either, you know. And they were judged on how highly motivated they were. So we made the comment, of course, that, oh, well, you know, kids from Eton come there. Well, nothing much different nowadays, then, is it really? But nevertheless, this was the motivation was the interest, was the concern. That was what you had to do to get in. Not to have the formal qualification, to show that you could handle this model of working. Now, the more standard one that's happened, you know, since the proliferation of universities, you know, since the establishment of the great, I mean, my first degree was at Manchester, and that's one of the classic ones of that era, isn't it? Along with Leeds and Glasgow and stuff. In which you were dealing with much larger numbers of students and from a much variety of backgrounds. And then you got and the subjects, the range of subjects changed. So you got this lecture-based transmission model in which you were going there to hear what an expert said. The authoritative voice of a subject would be heard. And teaching at university level, as it was in many secondary schools of those times, of course, there wasn't a lot of disparity, really. A lot of it would be demonstrating if it was science. It would be telling and explaining. You know, you would have, you know, if in literary studies you'd have somebody explaining a text. In medicine you'd have somebody demonstrating perhaps how you do a dissection. And the idea was that students get to hear the subject as she is spoken. You have access to the expert. You hear it really spoken. Now, lectures have been identified as being problematic, but we shouldn't forget their strengths. I mean, Andy did some interesting sort of informal research with students at an OU summer school, because the OU, as John again will remember, had a time when the educational kind of technology people at the OU were very much against the idea of lectures. That's why you didn't actually get a lot of OU lectures on the TV, you know, you didn't get a lot of people just, you know, only a few, I think maths guys with kipper ties, wasn't it? But on the whole, yeah, still. And that was because they said, oh, lectures, oh, terrible things, you know, you shouldn't be lecturing or instructing, you should go away from the sage on the stage to the, I forget what the alternative was now, the guide on the side, that's right. And you should be offering, you know, facilitating and not leading. Now, Andy actually thought, you know, this is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And they said, well, you know, there's all this research showing that students don't actually retain a lot of facts from lectures. You know, it's all well known. You can show them that they don't retain a lot of factual knowledge. And he thought, well, there's more to it than this. So he went along to summer school where Stuart Hall was speaking, who's a very famous British sociologist. You'll know, many of you, yeah. And you know, great. It was great to have him at the OU. And he always did the introductory lecture at the one of the social science sociology summer schools. And Andy said he'll do the classic thing. So he got the postgrad people to actually ask the students at the end what they retained from Stuart's lecture. But he also asked them what they got from it. And what did they get? They came out saying, oh, I think sociology is the best thing ever. I'm really going to do it. Wow, it's changed my whole, you know, idea. I can't wait now to get started, you know. And he said what they did get exactly from Stuart was somebody speaking the subject with conviction in an accessible way, but one that made them think, wait, I get that, but, you know, there's more to find. And he said, if you're just going to be the facilitator who just kind of says, well, what do you want to learn? I'll help you. You're never going to get that, really. And so I think we should think of what the powers of lectures are. The problem with them is, of course, that they're not dialogic. I mean, look, this is it. Here I am talking about dialogue, and who's speaking? Me, right? And as one of our colleagues said, you know, sometimes after about 10 minutes, you see the shutters go up on the students and they get their mobile phones out, don't they, and stuff. You know. And it depends a lot on charisma and things like that. So there are problems, but there are strengths. And so, like the IET people at the OU, a lot of people went from about the 60s into this kind of constructivist model, based on a psychological model of learning called Constructivism, of course. Based on, quite understandably, on the concerns that students weren't being active enough. They were having to do all the time what you're doing now. And the idea was that the teacher provides these conceptual problems, but you void explanations and instruction. Now, that is an antidote to some of the things that are wrong with lectures and with the apprentice expert model. And so I'm, again, it wasn't silly to look at how that applies. But there are problems with it. One is, if it marginalises a teacher's expertise, it's pointless pretending you're not an expert when you are. And as when the OU, I remember, moved out to Singapore to do things there, where you've got a very different educational culture, and they tried people doing, the guide on the side. Some of these very quiet and attentive Chinese students would turn suddenly into these rather cross people who said, I didn't come here to hear for you to hear what I think. I came because you're a British expert in psychology, And so, it can marginalise the expertise. And there's also, do we all rediscover the wheel? What's the point? Newton said he stood on the shoulders of giants, and he knew what they'd said, You didn't just start from scratch. It's pointless. You've got the whole traditions of disciplines and subjects. Why avoid giving them the scaffolding of that and making them aware that that's what they need to know? You don't become a scientist by rediscovering science. You become, at least partly, by finding out what other scientists have explained and what they've found out. So, as you can probably see what the way I'm moving in this, we shouldn't be making these choices. It's like in schools, whole class teaching or small group work, or online, education or face-to-face. It's not a choice. It's not a choice in the sense of one's good, one's bad, we do that, we don't do that. We should be looking at the affordances of each possible mode and each possible way. These things have all worked in some way well at some time, and there are ways they can all be used effectively. So what we should be probably thinking of is how can we best achieve the various options? What we can say, however, is that some of them probably incorporate the recognition of the importance of actual dialogue more than others. And certainly the lecture-based model doesn't, unless it's offset by something else. The apprentice expert one, depending on who it was, I think people did get some sorts of dialogues that were probably quite profoundly, useful. And certainly in the last situation, you might have a dialogue, though again, you see, there were some ways of interpreting the constructivist model is that the teacher avoids, putting anything much but kind of help. But nevertheless, what I think we're moving to in the most recent concerns about teaching and learning, and certainly very, very aware of this in school, is the importance of constructing dialogues in which students have an active role, in which they're able to take some more active part than merely hearing somebody else speak. And I think this has been accompanied in our understanding of learning by a theoretical shift. I'm not sure which is a cart and which is a horse, but certainly that's the way things have changed. And I think what we've really done is moved from a constructivist model to more of a sociocultural model. And this is Paul Cobb, who's a maths educator, a British guy, but he's worked in America for a long time. And this is the sort of difference he says, that we're not really looking anymore just at individual learners when we're trying to understand learning. We're seeing that learners are nearly always part of a situation that involves other people, that the real process is teaching and learning in some way, and that these processes are social. Even neuroscientists, I did a presentation at the RSA recently, and Chris Frith, who's a neuroscientist from University College, did another one, and I was surprised to find he was saying similar things. He was sort of saying, as neuroscientists, if we want to understand the processes of the brain now, we should be really wiring several of us up while we're interacting and seeing how what lights up in common. And I think this is the way we are realizing the brain has evolved as a tool for co-constructing knowledge. That's what we've got. The big advantage over other animals is we're brilliant at doing that. And so that's the kind of thing. But of course, like all these ideas, it doesn't come from me. And it doesn't really start very recently. It starts from one of my academic heroes, Lev Vygotsky, who many of you will have heard of, certainly people in education studies will have heard of him by now, in psychology. He was a Russian psychologist of the early 20th century, a very romantic, glamorous figure, apparently amazingly attractive to women, also wrote poetry and directed plays, as well as doing this groundbreaking work with children with learning difficulties. You know, a thoroughly sickening character altogether on the whole. And even died romantically young of consumption at the age of 35. Stalin didn't like him because he was, well, probably too fuzzy and warm for Stalin. Stalin preferred Pavlov and his dogs when it came to learning. But so his work was suppressed for a long time, as you probably know, until people like Jerome Bruner and Jim Virch kind of recovered it in the, well, really in the 70s and 80s, and it only really became, didn't it, really known properly known by the 90s, really, I think. Anyway, he had some clever ideas, which were influenced by Marxism, of which I will return in a while, because he realized that not only is the brain designed for thinking collectively, we have this special tool that goes with it for doing so. And that if you're looking at children's learning, what you find is that all around them, they're hearing people talking about the world and talking to them. So unlike Piaget, who seemed to think it was a case of this kind of child as a kind of lone scientist kind of finding out about the world, people actually, you know, hear it being mediated in conversations all around, from when they're very young to when they're at university. And these ways of using language inevitably then influence ways of thinking, because he says once you've learnt language, it transforms the way you think as an individual. And this applies right to university level. Once you've learnt the discourse of literary criticism, or physics, or medicine, or business studies, you will be thinking, when you try, if you're a good student, you'll be thinking about the relevant phenomena in a different way, and you will be using that language to do so. It isn't merely a case of learning the jargon words if you're a good student and you've learnt what it really offers. You will be finding a new tool for making sense of the world, both collectively and on your own. So Vygotsky made this argument, and since his time, there's lots of evidence has come to support the ideas that he probably didn't have time to follow through to the end. But the other clever thing he said, other people had said that back to the ancient Greeks and so on, but the other thing that he said that was very clever, really, was that it's a sort of spiral. Once Newton had made sense of the phenomena he was interested in, using the ideas that he got and the existing ways of thinking from the previous generations, he made it available as new science. But it wasn't science until he got at least one other person to understand what he was on about. And he had to come up with new ways of describing it that made sense to others. And that's how it works. The ways of thinking that people generate and develop will move on to become slightly new ways of making sense of the world and ways of using language. So the best business studies students will move on to develop that subject. They won't just take it and use it. They will actually be developing that language, that discourse, and they will then offer that to the next generation. So you've got this spiral, and that's what education is. It's a way of, if you like, institutionalizing this spiral process effectively. If it's working well, it makes it work better than it would without universities, schools, or whatever. And this is essentially what Vygotsky was talking about. And so from his ideas, we kind of see that language and dialogue, and for me, they tend to more or less mean the same thing, though there are other ways of using dialogue, obviously. It's this tool, isn't it, that we either use well or badly. And as teachers in any level, it's one of the main tools of our trade. And it's a tool we can use for collectively making sense, but it's one we can actually apply, to learning and development as well. And then the students themselves get the benefit of this enhanced tool for their own learning. And so that's why I've suggested that we don't just interact with language, we interthink with it. I'm a bit nervous of having my name on the same page as good old Lev, but no less. It's below, isn't it? So this interthinking, I think, is something that we should be wondering about how much we're achieving. And certainly in schools, this is happening. People are concerned about this to a very great extent. Now, one of Vygotsky's contemporaries has been very influential as well. They didn't apparently know each other, at least nobody can work out that they did. But he also had a lot to say about dialogue, and he's a literary scholar called Mikhail Bakhtin. Some of them you may have heard of. And here's a picture of him. Not quite such a handsome fellow, I don't think, but nevertheless. And he really, like all Vygotsky's, you know, the publication dates are totally misleading, because that means when the English translation came out, you know, it would be a lot earlier, would be 1920 or 30 or something like that. He was really suggesting that thought is essentially dialogic, not just in certain situations. He was suggesting that really that is the nature and essence of human thought. And he was using this in relation to people's understanding of novels and the construction of novels. But people have seen his ideas, including many psychologists and other people, as being much more generally applicable. And he was really suggesting that if you think that human thought is based on the premise that a dialogue will occur, and if you offer an idea, it's only an idea that it only works as an idea if it stimulates a dialogue. So Newton's theory of gravity was only a good one because it stimulated it. I mean, Darwin's another good example. I mean, did it stimulate a dialogue? Certainly did. It's still going on, you know. So that's the idea that we should look at what is the essence and the stimulus for dialogue. And as higher educators, this must be one of our key concerns. And people have made lots of, you know, interesting comments about, you know, things that seem monologic are not if they stimulate some sort of response. My former colleague at the OU, Guy Cook, who's a professor of linguistics there, has done some very interesting research on popular culture, linked language in popular culture, drawing on these ideas. And he's pointed out, for example, that things that we think of as patently monologic, like advertising posters, you know, needn't be, because they can be acted on. And he's got a whole section in one of his books about graffiti, and this is one of his examples. I don't know if you remember this Fiat advert. If this car were a lady, it would get its bottom pinched. And the feminist response was, if this lady was a car, she'd run you down. Obviously addressed to the originator of the advert. And so there you have what appears to be a monologic message becoming the first stage in a dialogue. You know, somebody's made it dialogic. You've got two voices there. And of course, you've got a much more recent and relevant one, haven't we? There we are, you see. A monologic message, but somebody, and the nice thing about it, you've got you've got this intertextuality there, haven't you? We all know the source of that, don't we? With suspicious mind. With suspicious mind. You know, it's great. It invokes, you know, lots of shared knowledge. And there you are, you see. There's a great one. When I go for a bike ride sometimes to around Castlethorpe, which isn't that far from here. And there's a great one there there's an old water tank near the railway, and at some point somebody's written a graffiti which says, Sharon is beautiful. And underneath somebody else has written, by a blind bloke. So the essence of this is that, you know, we should be thinking of what stimulates dialogues and what are the, how can we harness the potential of certain apparently monologic texts and resources for stimulating dialogue, and where do we want them to go? Bakhtin said in rather more detail, he took this nice idea. He says, we don't learn words from dictionaries, we take them from other people's mouths. They're used words, you know. And that's true. And for students, they should have the opportunity of taking the words from mouth, and he used this word, appropriate. They should be appropriating the language of a subject so that it starts to become their own. It becomes something they can use to reason with. They're not just parroting it, they're taking it on in the way that you learn another language and you use it to good effect. But that doesn't just apply to language learning, it applies to any kind of subject. And so really, it's a case of, thinking what does the sociocultural perspective that these thinkers kind of offer, what does it really mean in terms of the way we conceptualize what we do? Well, one is this notion that knowledge isn't just located in people's heads, but it's in a community. And that's what a university offers students. It's a community that has knowledge in it. They will get access to knowledge that they wouldn't get easily anywhere else. That's part of what they're here for, whether they know it or not. That is what they're for, what it's for. And communities are places where dialogue takes place. Dialogue isn't just the exchange of information, but it's interthinking. It's a way that people think and construct knowledge together. That's what dialogue is. It's got to be two-way. I'm not convinced by the people who think that, yes, you can have a dialogue with a novel, to be honest. I think you read a book. You might have some good ideas, but unless, Shakespeare can hear what you think, it's not a dialogue. But you can see how it can be used as a basis for a dialogue. That is a different thing. And the academic subjects generate their own ways of speaking. I mean by that speaking, I put it in inverted commas because I mean writing or whatever, doing really as well, which students need guidance in learning. We shouldn't be expecting them to rediscover these. We shouldn't be scared of giving them the technical language if it's powerful language. And we shouldn't be expecting them to find it because if we know it, it's like saying, I won't teach you English, you've just come to this country, you better go and find it for yourself. It's crazy. So we've got to think of how to build that in, and yet in a dialogic way. And accepting that the most important learning that we do almost all is social and is mediated by others. We don't, on the whole, learn about the world totally on our own. There are significant others involved, and it's a case of what role do they take, and we need to be aware of this. So basically, saying that being educated means being inducted into some new community of discourse, which can be more or less specific and can be related to different subjects. And higher education at its best should encapsulate that early model of the apprentice scholar where you are immersed in a way of thinking that is natural here. It doesn't matter that it's not real world, because it's as real as anywhere. It's about what you're here for. And it's a case of learning, of being inside that community of thinking in a way that allows you to take an active role within it, which is where, the importance of dialogues and the legacy of a constructivist approach is still very relevant. If you look at what goes wrong sometimes when students, we did research at the OU about how well things have gone, and you get some very interesting comments which often do come back to things to do with language. Here's a beginning social science student, an adult, who got experience of doing other subjects, but not social science. And this is what she said, and you can see, the way she's expressed, these are her own words. And I think the fact she's put these things in inverted commas is quite interesting. Because she, when she says new words, she didn't really mean new words. She meant ways the words were used sometimes, like society. It actually meant something very specific, community. It wasn't just the ordinary meaning of the word. And because of her background more in the humanities, she wrote a story which wasn't what the tutors were looking for. And she was stuck, until she got some real help in seeing how social science was spoken. And as J. Lemke, the very famous American professor of science education, says, science education should make students fluent speakers of science. And the same applies to any subject. So it often is. I don't think it's wrong to focus on this one angle, because I think of the language and the discourse and the people's immersion in it and the use of it as a tool. Because I think it's often underrepresented. And one advantage I think the sociocultural model offers is to highlight that. It's one of its strengths that it does that. So what does the success of educational dialogue depend on? Well, they should be offered some accessible stimulus for entering a subject. That's where the monologic text might be important, where you get a stimulating thing, something that gets them going. It could be a Stuart Hall lecture. It could be something that isn't in itself dialogic, but nevertheless gets them involved with the subject. Then there's got to be some process whereby a common knowledge is developed between the teachers and learners, where the students are enabled not only to pick up what the teacher knows, but the teacher has some way of working out what the students do or don't know. And I think this is often a difficulty. I find it a difficulty in higher education, which I think a primary teacher would have less difficulty because you're with them all the time. You know, I get MPhil students coming in, and I give them my little lot of lectures, and then they're off again, and I'm then teaching the PGCE next day. It's very hard. And I think there have got to be institutional ways of dealing with it, which we try and do at Cambridge, but it's not easy. Because you need, as a teacher, to have the right information to make the right judgment. You know, I'm making assumptions today. I didn't think I could assume everybody knew all about Vygotsky, so I explained him a bit. But I assume you all know what a lecture is and what universities normally are like, because, you're here, aren't you? And I guess I'm making those guesses. But it's a difficult guess and in some situations, especially for novice students, isn't it? And so you've got to, check whether you've got the right information. And the other thing is then, are we offering them opportunities to practice speaking the language? And I'm not always sure that we do. To take long turns, not just give brief answers. In school, this is a big deal now about whether students get long turns. My colleague at Cambridge, Robin Alexander, who some of you know has been the author of the Primary Review, very controversial and influential in some circles at least. Is this one of the things that he particularly has been promoting in primary schools? And I think we have to wonder, well, okay, that's primary schools, but one of the things I want us to consider is how different are the constraints and expectations of what we should do in universities from those in schools. There are obvious differences, but perhaps we should be worrying about some of the same things. And we need to give the students a chance to do these kind of things. And I think this is one thing that we really ought to be thinking about. Because, if you just little bits, I won't, of data I've got, here's one, recorded in a science, in a university in a science setting. Small group, wasn't a large group of people or anything. And, the lecturer wrote, kilogram meters per second on the board equals a Newton. The student said, in fact, I'll explain where this came. Let me just explain. I had a student at the OU, so she was doing a PhD, although she wasn't based around here. She was she's a lecturer at Strathclyde University. And she was interested in this whole notion of dialogues and learning. So what she did was, being an arts graduate, really had done English language, linguistics as a first degree, she signed up in her own university to do engineering, right? Mechanical engineering. And so she began it. She had done maths A-level, so she was kind of all right. And she went along and observed from the inside what it was like. And Christine Sinclair, she's called. And she found it fascinating because she said, if you ever, abstractly, you thought it was a different discourse and a different language, this really was, it was really a big deal. And even the pedagogy styles were so different than what she was using herself. Anyway, this is a bit of her data. The lecturer wrote that on the board, right? A student said, how are we supposed to know this? To which the lecturer turned around and said, I don't want to get bogged down on this question. Student, do we need this for the assessment? What's going to be in the first assessment? Lecturer just goes on writing. Right, let me just really basically ignore the question. At the break, she recorded in her notes. This student said he felt he was the dunce, and he shouldn't have said anything because nobody else did. But the neighbour said, no, good on you, mate. I don't have the bottle to ask. So they wanted to ask, but they didn't feel they could. It wasn't a dialogic environment, and the lecturer made that utterly clear. And she said if she'd been worried at all about her, linguistics lectures being not very dialogic as settings, she said, she was a million miles different from how engineering was done. And so, this obviously wasn't even a concern for that person. That's Christine's name at the bottom. Now, Phil Scott, who's Professor of Science Education at Leeds, has talked about how we should, in school education, but he applies this to his own teaching at Leeds, we should think of there being different ways of approaching communication in education environments. And he has these different dimensions, the authoritative, dialogic, interactive and non-interactive. But I'll just showing you that's the way he represents it, but I think I can simplify it for the sake of time into saying what he's really saying, as much as anything, is that there are two dominant modes of educational thought. One is the authoritative. It's more or less what I'm doing today. You've invited me here because you think I'm some kind of expert, I've got something to say. At least I've been thinking about something that perhaps you've not had the time to think about recently, so I'm offering you it. It's a lecture, it could be a demonstration, it could be some instruction, right, on how to do a proof in maths or something, right. On the other hand, you've got this much more interactive dialogic mode in which my voice wouldn't be privileged to have all the time, in which it would be equally important that I found out what you thought as that you found out what I thought. In which you may want, there may be that peer groups of people work together and work out what they understand, don't understand, and the whole group actually then feeds back. And the lecturer's role isn't to say rubbish, or I don't want to get bogged down with this question, it's to find out, because then they've got more knowledge themselves about what the students don't know, or what they do know, and I won't waste any time. Great, everybody understands that. Right, we can move straight on to X. And the students themselves get this practice in using the discourse. They discuss problems and misunderstandings, and they know it's okay to do so, that they're not wasting time, they're not being dunces, and whatever. Now, he argues that just as with those different modes, different models of higher education, he's not saying that's bad, and he's not saying this is good. That is, again, old thinking. What we think is, what do we need when and what for? When is a lecture a good idea? When is dialogue a good idea? And how do they fit together? And are we getting the balance right? And I think this is really the kind of thing to think, really. If we think of some implications for practice, then one of them is Phil's message, really. We should strive for some overall balance between these different modes, the authoritative and the dialogic. There should be some opportunities for interthinking. Students should be thinking collectively in higher education, not necessarily with the authoritative voice intervening all the time. It can be online. Charles Crook at Nottingham has done some very good stuff about how students can effectively use online chat to reach, in a useful and productive educational way. But they will need guidance in how they use this specialised tool within any one subject or an area as a tool for reasoning. It's not just a way of saying in jargony ways the same thing. It actually is a way in which you get to certain sort of conclusions implicitly based on some sort of theories or ways of modelling the world that make quite a difference. So I think this idea of a tool for reasoning and then being guided in it is quite important. And I know it happens. I know Lynn, and our colleagues in the education department here, that's one of the things that they make it very clear that the student teachers have to realise that that's what they are, that they're guides for the students to learn how to use, their own students to learn how to use talk as a tool for reasoning in the classroom. And inevitably it means that they're having to learn how to do it as teachers themselves. So, it doesn't happen everywhere, but I know it happens here. And I think it's important, that it happens more places. And I think there are other implications. You can go on and on, but I won't. Assignments. Well, they shouldn't just be things that assess what we do. And John knows that the OU, this was taken very seriously. They were seen in that way. And I'm sure it is lots of places. Lots of these things you'll be doing or your institutions. But I'm not sure we've consolidated them necessarily in a way that kind of, helps enough, especially for new people, say, entering the profession and so on. And I think this is quite important. When I gave a talk on these things, I gave a talk at the early conference in Amsterdam last year on my research on school education and other people's, in which I was arguing for the importance of dialogue in classrooms. And there's loads of evidence now, since Vygotsky's time, we've got lots of hard evidence to show that dialogue really is important and it works. And all these people, big room, all clapped and said, I was saying teachers ought to be doing this more, and they all clapped. And one of the people came up at the end, who's a lecturer in Free University Amsterdam. He said, you know what I wanted to ask, she said, but I didn't. She said, all these people who clap you so much about what teachers ought to do, she said, they're all lecturers in universities from all over the world. I would like to ask them how much dialogue is going on in their classrooms. And I think we could argue, oh, well, no, universities are utterly different than primary schools, so much so that the imperative to make more dialogue happen doesn't matter in a university. I think we have to have a good argument to sustain that, to be honest. And I think the revolution, the dialogic change that's happening in schools, as far as I can see, has not really yet reached universities. And I think it shouldn't look the same, but I don't think we can afford to avoid that question. I think it's something that we have to take seriously and come up with our own practical answers to it. Thank you very much.